This video will explain how imperialism affected Japan, and as you'll see, the impact of Western influence during the age of imperialism in Japan was very different when it came to the outcome in Japan as it was in China. So we have an interesting compare and contrast between China and Japan in the age of imperialism. Japan will end up, as you can see from the title, building a modern nation and rising to become a modern empire, just like those that we see in Europe. Early history of Japan. The first history of Japanese society as we know it goes back to about the year 300. Early Japanese society was a migration from ancient Chinese civilization across the strait between Korea and Japan to the island of Japan, and eventually created and settled its own culture. It was originally run by clans like the Yamato clan, and then Japan they take part of their culture from China, as I mentioned, but they have a feudal system from roughly 1000 to 1700. Now what's crazy about that is from 1300 to 1500 or so, about a 200-year time period, in Europe there is an almost identical feudal system with minimal interaction, if any, between the two societies. I always find that to be quite mind-boggling. But just like you had lords and knights and peasants, in Europe you had shogun and samurai and peasants in Japan. They did have a puppet emperor, an emperor with very little power. Mostly the shoguns, or the equivalent of lords in Japan, really ran the show during the feudal era of Japan. And it's during that feudal era that Japan isolates itself from the rest of the world. Europeans reached Japan around 1600. The Dutch, who were really dominating trade at this time, surprise, surprise, open up a port and establish trade in Japan. But they trade two things that really bother Japan: guns and Christianity. Guns, because a feudal society like Japan relies mostly on swords and bladed weapons, on horses, so you never want to be the guy who brings a sword to a gunfight, most of the time at least. So guns would have a serious, a game-changing effect on warfare in Japan. The other thing is Christianity. The religion of Japan at the time was Shintoism, which is very basically means that there's a spirit presence in all of nature, and the emperor is kind of a special chosen person who connects to that spirit presence, and that's the justification for having an emperor. Christianity, as you may know, doesn't have a very similar doctrine, and it has a different focus on a savior, a messiah, and one God. So this Christianity challenges the beliefs of Shintoism, and this clashes with Japanese culture. So the Tokugawa shogun, who were in charge at this time, they banned Christianity, and they closed the doors of Japan for about 200 years in the mid-1600s. Nobody's allowed in, nobody's allowed out. There's a little bit of trading in one port in Nagasaki, but other than that, think of Japan taking their culture, their society, throwing it in some Tupperware for 200 years and keeping it airtight. So here's a picture of a samurai. For example, we can see a lot of similarities to a medieval knight in Europe. So how does Japan eventually open up? Well, the American Navy arrives in 1853 under the direction of Commodore Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, a little bit early for that, but a different Matthew Perry, shows up because, like we talked about in the China video, the United States is looking to expand their influence and their economic influence in Asia. And when they arrive, they demand that Japan open up for trade. And Japan's kind of like, well, you know, we've been closed for about 200 years. We're not going to open for the United States. Sorry, thanks for the offer. Matthew Perry uses something that we call gunboat diplomacy, where he basically shows the force of the modern American Navy to the Japanese emperor and the Tokugawa shogun. He says, I will be back. I'm going to ask one more time, and if you don't open up to us, we will force you open with that Navy. And they're forced to open by threat of the modern American Navy. Again, this is called gunboat diplomacy. And not long after that, that's the beginning of the end of the Tokugawa reign in Japan. And in 1868, we have something called the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor is really given all the power, and the Tokugawa shogun are dismantled in Japan. And this is the beginning of the modern era. We always say that Meiji Restoration is the beginning of the modern era in Japan. And here's just a painting of Matthew Perry arriving with the American Navy delegation. So once Japan opens up, they're going to catch up with modernization that they missed. Imagine all the things you miss by being closed off from the rest of the world from about 1650 to 1850. The scientific revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, the entire Industrial Revolution, all of the revolutions of Europe, nationalism, all of that stuff. Completely missed the boat on it. So they have a lot of catching up to do. So they end feudalism after the Meiji Restoration, and they go out and they study Western nations. They study industrialization, and they come back and they build factories and they build railroads in Japan. They study governments, and we always think of the United States as being the best government, right? The best democracy. Of course, why wouldn't they pick our constitution as their model? They actually picked Germany's constitution. And this is because Germany had a strong Kaiser with a parliament called the Diet. But they liked this model because Japan wants to have a strong emperor, carrying along with Japanese tradition, and a diet. They actually call their legislative body the Diet, just like Germany's, that works with them, but that strong emperor really appeals to them. And the German military was one of the best land military forces in the world. So they modernized an industrial economy in a short amount of time, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And before you know it, we start to see the rise of the Empire of Japan. And this is the sun, the rising sun. Japan was the Empire of the rising sun, partly because they're one of the first countries to see the sun rise every day in the world, and also because they are an emerging power in this time period. So it's interesting to think about this, but in less than 50 years, Japan goes from an isolated nation that's still on horses and wielding swords to a strong army and a strong navy and a modern industrial economy. And they did have extraterritorial rights put on them, just like China did. But when they become powerful, they're able to end those extraterritorial rights, and there's nothing that the British or the Germans or the Americans can really do about it because Japan is strong enough to push back. But Japan decides that they want to be the dominating force in Asia instead of having a European empire or many European empires dominate Asia. Japan wants to be an Asian empire. So their first step in building that empire is they take Korea from China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, and we talked about this in the last video, but China was a very weak country. So this was kind of a slam dunk for Japan. So not a lot of credit was given to Japan by the Western countries. In fact, if you look at some primary source documents, Teddy Roosevelt himself even kind of discredits the ability and of the Japanese people and doesn't see them as intellectually and politically equal to the United States or Western countries. But it's the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 that really gets the attention of the Western world, when Japan takes on one of the great powers in Europe for control of Manchuria. And Russia is expected to win this war, because think about where Japan was just 37 years before it, but they actually get embarrassed and their navy gets crushed. And Japan takes Manchuria, which was originally China's, takes it from Russia, and before you know it, Japan is building its own empire in Asia. So in just a matter of 50 years, Japan goes from being forced to open up and being way behind industrially and technologically to becoming a strong Asian empire that's going to play a very important role in world affairs in the 20th century.